Hollywood, TV, streaming, whatever, doesn't understand sword fights or fencing or how they're different. Hi, I'm George. Welcome to my channel. And this is going to be what I'm calling a happy rant about something I just noticed as I've been watching TV, some streaming shows. And that is that Hollywood, streaming, whatever, doesn't know what what sword fighting is or what fencing is. And I think I'm going to focus more on what the fencing is. I'm not a fencer, but I know tangentially I am more of a sword fighter. I do stage combat. Swords are my thing I really enjoy. I've been studying HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, specifically Amazari longsword. And I don't know if it's maybe a curse with that knowledge, even just the basic understanding of like plays and how sword fighting actually works and how you actually exist in combat world with a sword. To watch a TV show or movie or something and notice that the sword fighting is not how swords work, which is fine for TV and film, but the more egregious thing I've noticed, the inclination that fencing is sword fighting, which it is, but it's not. That's where I'm going to approach this from. Again, not a fencer, I'm a sword fighter. So if you are a fencer and you have some comments from me, please leave them in the comments below, because I've always been interested in fencing. It's just I took the sword fighting route of like HEMA and stage combat versus actual fencing. So what caused me to notice this? Well, about a year ago, I was watching Hawkeye, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was a lot of fun. But there is, of course, what is he called? The swordsman, I think, Jack, mustache man. That guy, he's specifically sword play and whatever his other sword fights. But there's one specifically where Kate Bishop fights him, is like trying to figure out he's the bad guy. But so she challenges him to fight.
So it seems you're quite the sword aficionado, Jack. You fence?
Because she's like, I was world-class fencer, Olympic level.
I was a 2-time state champion.
And then they have a sword fight. And that was the first instance of this that I noticed where I was like, because I was just learning how to actually sword fight. I was learning HEMA at that point. I had just started. And I was like, this is very stage combat Hollywood sword fighting. But also just in its concept, in the world of the show, being a good fencer doesn't mean you know how to like sword fight, like in a duel, because fencing is a sport. They're very, very different concepts and ideas. One is about winning a competition and gaining points. It's about form. It's also like in kendo. Like kendo is not actually like sword fighting or like an actual duel. It has its rules where you have to have good form. You have to shout. You have to have a clean hit. That's not sword fighting. That is a sport. That is like a fist fight. Like MMA is more, it's like real fighting. And there's techniques in there, but then it's scored and won differently than a karate tournament. But that's the difference, is fencing is a sport and it has its own rules and it's very tough. But then like sword fighting is its own thing that doesn't really have rules, just has techniques you learn and then hopefully they work out. So that was the first time I noticed this, and that just found it very, I was like, okay, it's a comic book. The fight was pretty fun. A couple things that I'll get into that I found just funny about it. Sometime after that, I watched The Princess on Hulu. Joey King movie. It's about a princess fighting down a tower. It's very fun. There's some other things that have production-wise, like design-wise, I thought were kind of weird in my mind. And yeah, I maybe make a video on those because I just want to talk about them. But specifically the sword play, fantastic fights up till the princess character fights like a whole bunch of guys as she's going on like a staircase with swords. And then I started noticing, I was like, all right, at that point I learned more and I was like, these are just the same techniques as the fencing fight, just with different swords. And that's Hollywood sword fighting. Like Hollywood, the way Hollywood does swords, there hasn't been like a sword revolution in Hollywood since the 50s or 30s, maybe even when silent films and like Zorro was a big thing and like that all came out. They made these sword techniques. That's how sword fighting's taught for stage and screen, except for a couple like more Eastern like Kung Fu movies, it gets different, but for Western sword play, it's all the same stuff, and it's not how anyone actually fights with swords, because, this is the weird recursive loop, it mostly stems from fencing. But then, at least these couple ones, so Hawkeye, and then the other one I saw recently was Wednesday. the Netflix series with Jenny Ortega, there is the Tim Burton one. There is a fencing duel in the first episode, and it is so. I laughed. I had to pause it, and I laughed out loud. It's a great fight, like choreography, fun, and I think if it was not presented as a fencing specifically fight, it would have been like, yes, awesome, super. But in the canon of the show, it's Wednesday fencing with another student. This is where the weird recursive loop goes by, because this was specifically a fencing duel with the rules. Sure, it's slightly heightened world, whatever, but specifically a fencing duel that turns into an actual sword fight with techniques that would never be used in fencing. So it's not an actual sword fight because it's using fake techniques made for stage and screen to keep it like teachable and safe and everything and look good. But then it's not an actual fencing fight because it has used those techniques to make it closer to a real sword fight, but it's using fencing techniques to make a real sword fight. So it's not a real sword fight, but it's not also a fencing. Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot to think about. Again, I'm just voicing these thoughts that I'm having. Maybe you've noticed these things too. Maybe now you'll be cursed with this knowledge as well and you start noticing it. But it's just little things. Like, again, I'm not a fencer, but I have some friends who are fencers who also are learning and have learned HEMA with me. We were doing some drills where the goal is just not to get hit. So move out of the way and then you swing and then you move out of the way as they swing and then they strike at you. And they kept getting hit. And then they said to me, oh yeah, I think it's some just habit I have because when I did fencing in college, the motto of my coach was die with good form. You can get hit, but keep your good form because it's a sport. You're learning a sport. Like, it's like with running. Don't break your form. Even if you're losing, don't break form because, like, form is what you have in a sport. And form is what you have in, like, a martial art as well, but it's to serve the purpose of not getting hit. So if you have the choice, especially in a sword fight, to not get hit versus keep your form, don't get hit. That idea is kind of a difference between the two. But then you have the weird middle ground of Hollywood, which is saying we have to be stylized, we have to do all this, so we have to keep form. Maybe went nowhere, that tangent. But the middle ground interesting thing is real sword fighting is about guards and breaking them, and it really is about distance and closing them. Fencing is also about distance, but also it's about the weapon you're using, and you're about scoring points. So you want to hit specific targets or not get hit, and there's different point scoring totals and everything. And it's even different than like HEMA fencing, which is closer to actual combat, where it's basically don't get hit or get a hit and get out of there. And then the last, maybe a little end to this tangent of kind of going nowhere, which maybe I'll make a longer actual like history video on this because I am interested in this topic. And if you are too, let me know below if you'd like to see a video on like the history or like evolution of stage fighting to fencing, or fencing to stage fighting to then being in movies, to then the modern sword fights, and also like how that works in with like kung fu movies. And also a big thing that's really interesting is that most people who do like fight choreography know the martial art they're doing, but people who do sword choreography really only know the Hollywood sword choreography. They aren't like sword fighters. The last thing I want to mention that also I find hilarious in terms of like fencing is they're not using a real weapon. Not a real fencing weapon, not a real sword. Like, it'd be different if they were for some reason fencing with rapiers, but it's like, that's a real sword. They're using single swords, which are made up of fencing parts, but they're not a like regulation weapon. It's this thing. Flippity flappity. Which is made of fencing parts, yes. It does look like a fencing sword, but it's not, because it's made up of an epee blade, so that's a swishy flicky one, and it's made up of a saber guard is really the big difference. And then we also have a French grip and a French pommel. So it's not a pistol grip, which is a common thing for modern fencing, especially with the quicker blades. So a foil's the swishy flicky, really small one with a really thin blade. Epee is the next size up, but usually you can also, I think you usually have a discard with it. Again, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But then a saber has a thicker blade. It's a little more slashing as opposed to stabbing. There's also different scoring points, different ways of scoring for each style of fighting. Different parts you can hit on the body, etc. That's why I also noticed that the fights were just using Hollywood, because this is the thing that you use on stage, that you use in Hollywood for like Three Musketeers, Buccaneer, you need a quick sword, you go with a single sword. They're cheap, easy to make. Like I said, this is one I made myself out of fencing parts. You can buy them pre-made, but again, they're just pre-made from fencing parts, so not like forged. But you can also see like this is not a professional one because it still has a practice tip on it and it's going to focus. Still has a flat tip as it's not been ground off anyway. they're using single swords, which is also hilarious to me when they're supposed to be fencing, because it's not a real sword, and it's also not a real fencing weapon.
Would you say you're more an épée, foil, or saber man?
Oh, you know your stuff, little lady.
So that is just another thing that I noticed both in Hawkeye, first off the bat, and also the funniest thing too for both that, and specifically in Wednesday that mentioned it. Wednesday, they don't have this practice tip on their single swords. Like on their épée blades. They don't. They're the smoothed down tip that you would use for a stage weapon or a film weapon where you're trying to pretend it's a real sword. But then Wednesday has a line where she's like, let's take off the tips. So, because it's like they want to duel to first blood.
No masks, no tips. Winner draws first blood.
So it's like, first of all, you're using actually sharp weapons that a fencing weapon for practice shouldn't be sharp in any sense, because also they're usually not made to be sharp. They're not really like combat swords. So like Hema, you might have a rubber tip on, but even then it's dulled already, and it's just because the point's so thin. And also, she says the tips, but then the person slashes her and she gets a cut, so it's not even a stab. And then they don't have the flat tips anyway, they have the sharp tip. Anyway, there's just a little rant just off the top of my head how Hollywood doesn't really understand fencing versus swordplay, like versus a duel. They are different, very different styles, very different points to them. And like, just because you're a good fencer doesn't mean you're gonna be a good sword fighter. And just because you're a good sword fighter doesn't mean you're gonna be a good fencer. Like there's videos from like whatever news sites about that, where it's like fencer tries Hema, or like Hema tries whatever. Like they're very different sports and martial arts and all that. And Hollywood doesn't understand story-wise, and it's maybe a burden of knowledge I'm cursed with, and maybe now you're cursed with watching this video, but they're not. It's so funny to me. It just makes me laugh. Like it actually makes me pause stuff. So anyway, that's a little rant about Hollywood and sword fighting. This might branch into other videos. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, learned something. If you have comments about this or want to know more about these kind of topics, leave them below in the comments down below. If you like this video, please do. Please like that. Click that like button. And also subscribe if you want more of these kind of things. Me ranting about topics. I like these happy rants and calls. I'm not angry. This is all fun. There'll be some other weird videos popping up from here and there as I just make stuff. So subscribe for content like that, because I'm very passionate about this. Happy rants. And yeah, take care, and I'll catch you on the next happy rant.